about 30 seconds or so for people to jump on and for us to make sure that we're live on YouTube, and then we'll be good to go. All right, very good. Well, guys, thank you so much for jumping in on this very first episode of Beyond the Echo Chamber. This is a new experiment from the Faithful Politics Podcast universe, where we're trying to get great content out for you guys to see what's going on in the world, to dig deep into trends that are happening right now. So thank you guys for jumping on and being a part of this with us today. Of course, I am Josh Bertram. I am your host on the Faithful Politics Podcast, your faithful host. And we have our political co-host, and he's behind the scenes today. So thanks, Will, for all you're doing and helping there. And also, of course, guys, want to make sure that you know about our Faith Roundtable. It happens on the same channel. Make sure that you're subscribing to the Faithful Politics Podcast channel. You can go there, find us on YouTube, or go to faithfulpoliticspodcast.com and make sure that you guys are there. If you're in the Richmond area, I'm also the pastor of River City Underground. You can go to rivercityunderground.com and check us out there if you want to do that. But we're going to jump into our stuff today. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest on this very first Beyond the Echo Chamber. I do want to make sure you guys know about our chat. So make sure that you utilize the chat function within Riverside and within Riverside to ask questions, to check things out. We're also going to have Will behind the scenes kind of talking to people. And if you're able to do that on YouTube live as well, please go ahead. We want this to be interactive. So, guys, thank you for being here. And I'm going to introduce our guest today. Today, we have the pleasure of having on once again Dr. Matthew Taylor. He is the senior Christian scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies in Baltimore, where he specializes in American Christianity, American Islam, and Christian extremism and religious politics. His new book, The Violent Take It by Force, The Christian Movement That is Threatening Our Democracy, came out in 2024. It tracks how a loose network of charismatic Christian leaders called the New Apostolic Reformation was a major instigating force for the January 6th insurrection and is currently reshaping the culture of the religious right in the U.S. He is also the author of Scripture People. He holds a PhD in religious studies and Muslim Christian relations from Georgetown University and an MA in theology from Fuller Theological Seminary. He also serves as an associate fellow at the Center for Peace Diplomacy in New Orleans, where he works on preventing religion-related violence surrounding the U.S. elections. And it's great to have you on Beyond the Echo Chamber, Matt, to give a little bit of not just a little bit, a deep dive into some of your work. So thank you for coming on and being with us today.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Will. I'm grateful to be part of the greater Faithful Politics universe, as you put it there. So let me kick this off here. So
yes, please.
The title we've given to this presentation is "Has Evangelical Christianity Become a Threat to American Democracy?" And I realize that is a provocative and perhaps confrontational framing. So I want to be really precise in defining my terms here. But I also want to timestamp this because things are changing rapidly every day. And so we are speaking on the afternoon of March 28th, 2025, just over 2 months after Trump's second inauguration. I want to give a quick outline for where I'd like to go. So first, I want to show you a gallery of some very curious prayer photos that have emerged over the last decade. And then I want to try to really clarify and define some of our terms. What do we mean by evangelical Christianity? What do we mean by American democracy? What would constitute a threat to American democracy? Then I want to try to tell, and this will take up most of our time, tell the little known backstory of how and why evangelical Christians embraced Donald Trump. And so most of our time will be kind of looking at this kind of narrative. And then at the very end, I want to come back and evaluate where we are right now in American democracy, where things stand today, and assess whether or not evangelical Christianity poses a threat to it, and try to answer this question from our title. So let's look at some photos. If you go back about a decade from now, you start finding these photos almost as soon as Donald Trump enters presidential politics. He joins the presidential campaign, the Republican primary in June of 2015. And you start getting really in the fall of 2015. So just a few months after he enters the race, these photos of religious leaders, Christian leaders, praying over Trump. And once you go looking for photos like this, you can find dozens of them, beginning in the fall of 2015 all the way up until the present. And I'll show you a couple in just a minute from just a couple weeks ago. But some of these take place in the Oval Office. Sometimes they're in other rooms in the White House. And I have searched and searched, and I cannot find similar photos of George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, or Ronald Reagan, the three previous Republican presidents who also got a lot of support from the religious right. And yet there's this unique iconography that has been building up around Donald Trump. And you can find all these photos and even videos of Christian leaders. And I would just note, it's a remarkably ethnically diverse array of Christian leaders in these photos who are praying and prophesying over Donald Trump. And these tend to cluster around the different presidential campaigns, but sometimes they're just kind of popping up in the news as things are going on. And as we got closer and closer to the 2024 election, we had a few of these photos emerge right on the eve of the 2024 election, including this one from a Turning Point USA event towards the end of October of 2024, and then a gathering of Trump with his religious advisors. And these photos were a big part of selling Donald Trump as the Christian candidate, as being a candidate who had the support broadly of Christian leaders, who was even in the kind of argument that some Christians were making, was chosen by God for this role. And since Trump has assumed his second term, has been inaugurated, we found even more of these photos emerging from the Oval Office, some from just a couple of weeks ago. Here we have one from February 6th. And I'll talk about some of what else happened on February 6th, why this particular group of leaders was there. But we also had one just from a couple weeks ago on March 19th, where again, you see a group of leaders surrounding Trump. He's sitting at the Resolute desk, praying over him, touching him with their hands. So in what follows, I'd like to try to get to the bottom of these photos. Who are these leaders? And if you look closely, there's many repeat faces in these photos, even across the entire decade. Why are they praying over Donald Trump? How did they get this kind of access to the former and now current president? And why has Donald Trump, who's a notorious germaphobe, if you read any of the news coverage about Trump or the kind of the background of his biography, he hates being touched. He's very concerned about the spread of germs. And yet here he is allowing all these Christian leaders repeatedly to surround him and touch him. Why is he doing that? Why is he allowing that to even happen? So before we get there, though, I want to define some terms. And the first term I want to try to define is the term democracy. Democracy gets thrown around a lot, and everyone is seemingly for it, but often we're using this term without a lot of precision. So almost everyone claims to be for democracy, but here's my slightly adapted dictionary definition of democracy. I would say that democracy is a governing order in which the people, the demos, if we're going back to the ancient languages, which is made up of all eligible citizens, exercises rule over society through elections and elected representatives. And sometimes you'll find, especially in the United States, some people will want to make a distinction between a democracy, where people vote directly for policies, and a republic, where people elect representatives to enact those policies. If you look on a global scale, that is a distinction without a difference. That's kind of a silly, idiosyncratic American thing, that we want to make this distinction between a republic and a democracy. That's just not how it works. Functionally, democracies have elected representatives. Sometimes even republics have forms of direct democracy. It's all one thing. So in contemporary political science, though, there's a pretty basic distinction that gets made between what is called a liberal democracy and an illiberal democracy. And importantly, liberal here is not referring to liberal versus conservative, the way that it often gets used in our contemporary political discourse, but liberal is referring to liberties and the values of classical liberalism going back to the Enlightenment. So then a liberal democracy is a society that has fair elections with multiple parties that all can contend and function in those elections, that has a separation of powers, what we in the United States often call checks and balances, right? That there are different nodes of power within the government. The rule of law, as in an independent justice system that is not operating as a political entity, but is trying to enforce the laws and rules of our country neutrally, and protections for human rights and freedom of speech. This is that liberty part of liberal. And you can see on this color-coded map on the screen here that it's actually a quantifiable thing, how liberal a democracy is. And think tanks and different groups, some in the US, some around the world, will look at different democracies or acclaimed democracies and evaluate how much these values, these liberal values, are lived out. And the darker blue colors indicate strong liberal democracies, and then as you get into kind of the green and then the yellow shades, you're getting further and further from this kind of liberal democratic ideal. And what the United States, at least historically, aspires to be is to be a liberal democracy and to promote liberal democracy around the world. Now, by contrast, illiberal democracies are societies that might have some of the trappings of democracy, but they are severely limited. And these can range from these kind of more autocratic states that just have sham elections, all the way down to more backsliding democracies that are kind of slowly becoming less and less liberal. Often in these illiberal democracies, we find that they have the formal elements of democratic institutions. They'll still have elections, but very little separation of powers, very few individual rights. They begin curtailing human rights and liberties in favor of this state power. So even in Russia today, they will claim that they are a democracy and they will have elections. You just don't want to run against Vladimir Putin, or else you might end up in prison or dead, right? So Russia might say it's democratic, but it is not a liberal democracy. It is not even remotely. So most nations in the world do pay lip service to this idea of democracy, but there's a real wide gap between the pretense of democracy and the reality of democracy. Okay, a couple points before we move on. First is that democracy is not a binary on-off switch. It's not you are liberal or you are illiberal. It's actually a dimmer switch, right? It's a spectrum that that nations and governments move along and move back and forth on sometimes. And depending on how much a nation abides by its rules and norms and protects individual rights and has fair elections, we have a sliding scale on what qualifies as a true democracy. Now, the United States has historically gone through periods and stages of democratic growth, and I would especially point to the post-Civil War amendments to the Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments to the Constitution, as elements where you have this growth of a much more liberal trend in American democracy. But we've also gone through periods of democratic backsliding, like what comes right after those so-called Reconstruction amendments, where you have the instantiation of Jim Crow in the South. And I would argue that the United States has only really become a liberal democracy in the contemporary sense of that in the 1960s, when we had the civil rights movement and some shifts in Supreme Court jurisprudence that really allowed for the equality of all citizens of the United States, equality before the law, and participation in elections. Now, when we think about religion, liberal democracies have evolved various ways of relating to religious traditions. And the idea of the establishment of religion, which is just a fancy word that we find in our own Constitution, that just means is there an official religion? Is there an official religious tradition that is recognized by all the participants as in a democracy as the religion? So to give an example of this kind of messy interface between religious identities, I have an image here of the Archbishop of Canterbury crowning King Charles of England. I mean, this is what we in the United States would refer to as peak Christian nationalism, right? You have the established Church of England, and it's conferring authority onto a monarch, right? And that is textbook Christian nationalism. But at the same time, there's a long history in the United Kingdom stretching back at least to the 17th century of there being an established church. And the British monarchy itself is kind of vestigial and sort of a figurehead. So the fact that there is Christian nationalism, as we would term it in the US, in the UK, not necessarily a real threat. I would say that the United Kingdom is still a very strong liberal democracy today. So religious nationalism, not all religious nationalist movements pose a severe threat to all forms of democracy. Now, the religious movements that do threaten democracy are those that, and I have three kind of categories here. One is that they privilege one religious community's citizenship over others, so that some people are real citizens and some aren't, often based on their religious identity. Ones that use demonization and threats of violence to bring authoritarian leaders to power. And also religious movements that sacralize, as in make holy or baptize an authoritarian agenda using theology to make that the authoritarian agenda seem like gods, or the gods, if we're talking in a more polytheistic context, agenda, right? And a very prominent example of this today is Narendra Modi's India, where Modi is the at least the India claims to be a democracy, but Modi is the leader of a religious nationalist movement, the Hindutva movement, that is advancing Hindu interests. And often we find in India today violent outbursts against the smaller Muslim population in India. So that is, I would argue, an example of a religious nationalist movement that really does threaten Indian democracy. Now let's talk about American evangelicalism. And this is a very, very difficult movement also to define. And I would argue it's even a fool's errand trying to define evangelicalism in any global sense, just because there's so many different connotations and translations of this word and this concept into different cultures. So I'm just going to focus on the United States here. And I would contend that there are really three major ways of contemporary approaches to defining American evangelicalism. The option one goes back to a British historian named David Bebbington. He's taking sort of a thematic or theological approach to defining evangelicalism. And he argued, and this goes back to really the 1980s, that what unites evangelicals in the UK and the US across many centuries now are and many varieties, are these core theological commitments. What he calls crucicentrism, building theology around the Christian theology around the cross of Christ. Biblicism, taking the Bible as the central authority, and conversionism, by which he means the practice of evangelism and the normative assumption that you have to be born again. This is why the term born again is often used as synonymous with evangelical. And then activism, right? Putting your faith into action. And so Bebbington would say where you find these three things, or these four things clustered together, there you have evangelicalism. Now, option two is what we could call a form of self-branding, right? And this would include all Protestants who self-identify as evangelical or born again. And this is really the approach that the Pew Research Center takes. They'll when they're doing surveys of American religion, they'll ask, "Are you born again or evangelical?" And interestingly, now a large number of Catholics and an increasing number of Muslims actually answer yes to that born again or evangelical question. But Pew will only count the Protestants who are in there. So and if you do that kind of a survey, it shakes out to around a quarter of the U.S. population identifies as both Protestant and evangelical or born again. Now, the third option, and this is what's more used by the Public Religion Research Institute, thinks about evangelical as a religio-racial category. This is where you add whiteness to the definition, and you'll often hear this phrase, white evangelicals. That phrase is really more useful politically than theologically, but white evangelical is a useful political category because white evangelicals tend to vote as a bloc. And so they're fairly predictable in the way that they vote. And so the way that PRRI would count things is they would include all white Protestants who self-identify as evangelical or born again, right? So it's like the Pew, but then they're using it white as another filter to figure this out, and it works out to around 13-14% of the US population. Now, I think each of these approaches can be useful in different circumstances. I'm not out to say that any of these approaches is good or bad per se, but I think if we're going to try to understand the relationship between American evangelicalism and American democracy, and especially between American evangelicalism and Donald Trump, none of these options really helps. And what I'd like to offer is a different approach to thinking about this. And this is something I lay out in my book in some more detail. But it's really a 4 quadrants model. And we're using 2 questions to try to evaluate where people fit. And the first question is, are they denominational? Yes or no? And this is referring to groups or congregations or individuals. Remember, if you know anything about American denominations, denominations are how American Christians have historically sorted themselves. Denominations carry traditions and bind churches together. Denominations have bylaws and committees and sort of democratic governance. Now, the second question is, are they charismatic? And charismatic here just as a shorthand. We're not talking about people who have magnetic personalities, but we're talking about this particular Christian use of the term charismatic to refer to a spirituality that's built around recapturing the miraculous ethos of the early church. Right? Charismatics are Christians who speak in tongues, who believe in miracles, and who try to pursue miracles, who believe in modern prophecy. So if you take these 2 questions and you map them out like this onto a grid, we find 4 quadrants. And the first quadrant, what we could call quadrant 1, is where you have denominational belonging, but non-charismatic spirituality. And this is where I think most of us think of American Christianity as being centered, right? Most Catholics would fit under this. Most mainline Protestants, to be a mainline Protestant is to belong to a mainline denomination. Many historically Black Protestants, especially the older Black denominations, the ones that go back before the Civil War, and what we could call classical evangelicals, the Southern Baptists, the Presbyterian Church of America, evangelical free churches, right? So this is where I would argue even most of American Christians are probably clustered around this first quadrant. Now, the second quadrant would be non-denominational and non-charismatic. And this is a very old American impulse to try to set aside denominations in favor of an authentic biblical Christianity. It goes back even to the early 19th century, where you begin to have some of these groups break off from the denominations to go back to authentic or to restore Christianity. And today we would call these independent evangelicals. Bible churches, many of the post-fundamentalist churches, some of the independent Baptist churches. This sector is often more Calvinist and Reformed in its theology. And if you're familiar with evangelicalism, if you want to understand the second quadrant, I think of John MacArthur as just the prototypical character of the second quadrant. Now, the third quadrant is where you have the intersection of charismatic spirituality and denominational belonging. And this is where we would put the Pentecostals. Pentecostals are believers who belong to different denominations that trace their roots back to the Pentecostal revivals of the early 20th century. These are groups like the Assemblies of God or the Church of God in Christ. You also have a growing movement of charismatic Catholics around the world. In fact, Amy Coney Barrett, the Supreme Court Justice, grew up in a charismatic Catholic community. You also have a few charismatic mainline Protestant churches. These were kind of big in the 70s, but then mostly have died out today. But this section of Christianity is trying to contain the energy and revivalism of this charismatic impulse within the bureaucracy of denominations, which can get messy, but they've kind of worked out some stable models. Now, the fourth quadrant is where I really want to focus the rest of our attention today. And the fourth quadrant is where you have this space that is both charismatic and non-denominational. And another term for this is the independent charismatics. There's been incredible growth in this sector since the 1970s and 1980s. And really, this is the cutting edge of American Christianity. And I would even argue the cutting edge of global Christianity today. And this is a group that is intrinsically difficult to measure because often in our surveys, we don't ask if people are non-denominational, or we don't ask if they're charismatic. And so it's sometimes hard to find exactly who fits in this. But I just want to note in this model that there are evangelicals of different kinds in every quadrant, right? So it's not that one of these is the evangelicals. Evangelicals kind of are all over the map here, but they're different kinds of evangelicals. I would argue that the evangelicals who are in quadrant 1 are kind of the evangelical establishment, the old school evangelicals. Quadrant 2 would be these post-fundamentalist, schismatic evangelicals, kind of the hard-line, hard-edged, non-charismatic evangelicals. Quadrant 3 are these kind of measured legacy charismatics, right? The Pentecostals and other forms of charismatic belonging that are comfortable with denominations. And then quadrant 4 are these upstart, unregulated charismatics that we'll be looking at for the rest of our time here. Now, how do you know if you're looking at an independent charismatic church or group? Here's some of the markers, some of the characteristics you might find. A, as I said, this is the fastest growing segment of American Christianity and of global Christianity. The Center for the Study of World Christianity at Gordon Conwell Seminary estimates that in 1970, and this is what's on the chart there, in 1970, there were about 44 million independent charismatics in the world. But by 2020, their estimate was that it was up to 312 million. So we're talking about a portion of Christianity globally that is roughly doubling in size every 20 years. That is an incredible growth rate. Now, this is also, because it's a more global tradition and sector, ethnically diverse and globally connected. And you find all these ties between independent charismatics and other nations, other communities around the world. These folks believe in modern prophecy and participate in ecstatic spiritual practices. That's part of that kind of charismatic element. They put a very strong emphasis on what they call spiritual warfare, this idea that there are angels and demons who are all around us, who are battling in this invisible realm, and Christians can participate in that warfare. This is a very strong emphasis within this independent charismatic space. And this idea that we can, through prayer or other spiritual practices, fight back against Satan and Satan's forces. They're not tied to any denominational or accountability structures, right? So they're very autonomous, and that allows for a highly networked global leadership and celebrity class. So we sometimes think of non-denominational as like the absence of structure. But in fact, what has emerged in this independent charismatic space globally is a very highly networked global set of really thousands of these charismatic celebrities. Some of them pastors, some of them prophets, some of them apostles, some of them mega church pastors, some of them televangelists, some of them worship leaders, but they all kind of inhabit this celebrity class that is really deeply relationally networked. I sometimes talk about the fourth quadrant or these independent charismatics as the Silicon Valley of the American church. This is a space that is very innovative, very technologically savvy, a lot of eccentric personalities, a lot of entrepreneurial spirit, a lot of excitement and hope and focus on how do you grow, how do you build new things. Not a lot of regulation, not a lot of accountability, not a lot of enforcement of the rules in this space. So let's talk about some narrative and tell a story. So how did Trump gain such fervent evangelical support? I mean, north of 80% among white evangelicals in all three of the past three elections. And also, where did these photos come from? So I'm going to try to tell a complicated story that goes back to the 1950s. And it's really the story of the fourth quadrant and how the fourth quadrant came to be so wrapped around Donald Trump. Now, in my book, I really tell this story in a very different way, and I go through the profiles of 7 independent charismatic leaders and how all their journeys and stories intersect on January 6th and how they become central actors around January 6th. But in this lecture, I'm going to try to tell the story in a different way, front to back in a more condensed form. So we got to go back all the way to the 1940s and the 1950s for the beginning of the story. And what will happen over the next 30 or so slides is we're going to go through a timeline from the 1940s all the way to the present. And there's lots of places you could start the story, but I'm going to begin it in 1948. It's the end of World War II, the formation of the United Nations, the founding of the State of Israel. And it's in 1948 that a Pentecostal revival kicks off in North Battlefield, Canada, in Saskatchewan, called the Latter Rain Revival. The Latter Rain Revival begins in Canada and then spreads from there to the U.S. and really around the world. I mean, even churches that we think of as not being American, like Hillsong Church, this global charismatic church, traces its roots back to the Latter Rain revivals. And the Latter Rain leaders and some of the participants in this movement begin to focus in on something that they call fivefold ministry. And this is coming from Ephesians chapter 4 in the New Testament, and where it says Christ himself gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the pastors, and teachers to equip his people for works of service so that the body of Christ might be built up. And so as the latter rain folks who are, again, Pentecostal, they believe in this kind of charismatic spirituality. They believe in prophecy, and they come to believe in the midst of this revival that those 5 offices or 5 roles, apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, are the correct way to guide and lead the church. This is a different model of church governance that they would say is biblical. And many Christians would affirm elements of this, but especially the apostles and prophets. Most Christians would say apostles and prophets were forms of leadership very early on in the life of the church that don't exist today. But out of the latter rain, they start saying, no, we need apostles and prophets again today. And they start to have prophecies in their group that apostles and prophets will renew the church in the 20th and 21st centuries. But then again, the latter rain leaders are rejected by many of the Pentecostal denominations, and even the Assemblies of God, the largest of the Pentecostal denominations, in their 1949 General Council says, we disapprove of those extreme teachings and practices of the so-called New Order of the Latter Rain. And they basically kick the Latter Rain people out of the Pentecostal denominations. And so they migrate out into this non-denominational charismatic space. Now, if we fast forward to the 1960s, all the way through the 1980s, you have another revival that kicks off among kind of Pentecostals and evangelicals in the late 1960s called the Jesus People Revival. And this is another charismatic revival using these kind of charismatic forms of spirituality. And this brings legions of eager new converts, many of them ex-hippies. This is especially centered in California. Out of the Jesus People movement, we have the contemporary Christian music industry that we still have today emerges out of that. And also you have the emergence of different either denominations or movements within evangelicalism. The Vineyard, Calvary Chapel, Messianic Judaism comes out of the Jesus People revivals in the 1960s and 1970s. And then in the 1980s, you have these latter rain ideas are still percolating around. And so some charismatics start picking up and they start talking about a prophetic movement that where you have charismatic leaders saying that they are prophets. And they begin experimenting with this idea of apostles and building apostolic networks. And one of the central groups here is clustered in Kansas City. They call themselves the Kansas City Prophets, or at least other people call them the Kansas City Prophets. And it's especially centered around this guy, Mike Bickle, who goes on to found the International House of Prayer in Kansas City. Now, again, fast forwarding quite a bit, when we get to the 1990s, there's a professor named C. Peter Wagner at Fuller Theological Seminary, a fairly large evangelical seminary. And Peter Wagner is a professor of church growth, which is this kind of faddish evangelical theological idea that you can take the data of the social sciences and blend that with evangelical theology and produce growth. And so Wagner is this kind of data-driven church growth guy. And he's watching these independent charismatics, and he comes to believe that the independent charismatics, these non-denominational charismatics, are going to be the growth edge of the modern church. This is where the future growth of the church is going to happen. And in 1989, he meets one of these prophets. Her name's Cindy Jacobs. And Peter Wagner and Cindy Jacobs become very, very close. They become they refer to each other as kind of father and daughter, spiritual father, spiritual daughter, kind of a very, very close mentoring, almost adopted relationship. And Wagner and Jacobs worked together on something in the 1990s called the 1040 window campaign. And if I could see your faces, or I'd have you raise your hands to see who in the group remembers the 1040 window campaign. This was a huge endeavor in the 1990s, still talked about today. There's a massive missions collaboration that focuses on this space between 10 degrees north latitude and 40 degrees north latitude across most of North Africa, Central Asia, and Eastern Asia. And this is seen as the space that is the least Christian space on the globe. And Wagner and Jacobs are leading the prayer and spiritual warfare efforts over the 1040 window. This is kind of their task. This is where they become really famous. And so they're in this independent charismatic space. They're participating in this tens of millions of people praying for the 1040 window globally and sending missionaries and all. And it's in the 1990s that Wagner and Jacobs, and they wind up adding in another friend of Jacobs, a guy named Dutch Sheets. And they're evolving these spiritual warfare frameworks. And Wagner is a very kind of pragmatic and experimental guy. And he comes to believe that what we need are new styles of spiritual warfare in order for the church to grow, in order to conquer the 1040 window. And he calls this framework that he and Jacobs and to a limited degree Sheets come up with strategic level spiritual warfare, where they would try to gather mass campaigns of Christians praying, building out spiritual warfare prayer networks with tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people in these networks, where they start trying to map the territories of different areas by the different demons that control them. Wagner would talk about territorial spirits, as in high-ranking demons that need to be displaced. Those high-ranking demons, the territorial spirits, can control physical territory and human institutions. All these are very kind of wild ideas coming out of this independent charismatic space, but becoming fairly mainstream within evangelicalism through this 1040 window campaign. And the 1040 window campaign really culminates in what is called Operation Ice Castle, a special forces spiritual warfare attack on a demon that they have labeled the Queen of Heaven, that they claim through some of their prophecies in the group has a spiritual stronghold, a spiritual castle on the slopes of Mount Everest. And they actually send a strike team of spiritual warriors. Some of them are prepped by Cindy Jacobs. The part of the group is led by Doris Wagner, Peter's wife. And they go to the slopes of Mount Everest for 3 weeks in 1997 to do this Operation Ice Castle. You can see how they're building all this kind of military terminology and ideas into their spiritual warfare. And they go and do this attack on the Queen of Heaven. And they claim that they overpower the Queen of Heaven in 1997. And this is the culmination of this 1040 window campaign. Now, also in the 1990s, as all this is going on, Wagner is playing around with some of these ideas that he's hearing from people like Cindy Jacobs and others. And he comes to help coin this phrase in 1996 called the New Apostolic Reformation. He comes to believe that he is an apostle, and Cindy Jacobs even prophesies this over Peter Wagner. And so at this Fuller gathering, at Fuller Seminary gathering called the National Symposium of the Post-Denominational Church, they coined this phrase, the New Apostolic Reformation, and Wagner begins gathering a cluster of leaders around him, including Cindy Jacobs and Dutch Sheets, but also people like Becca Greenwood and Che On, one of his Fuller doctoral ministry students, Lou Engle, another pastor from Southern California, Chuck Pierce, a prophet and a mentee of Cindy Jacobs. And this inner circle begins to form around Peter Wagner, focused on this idea of the New Apostolic Reformation. And they write books like The New Apostolic Churches with this exciting kind of, this is kind of the it crowd in the independent charismatic space. These are the cool people. They're all gathering around Peter Wagner. And in 1999, Peter Wagner retires from teaching at Fuller Seminary, and he goes on to try to build this New Apostolic Reformation idea. And the way that he conceives of it is that it's supposed to be networks. So he starts building out these networks. It's not a denomination. He does not want this to be a denomination. So it's a very low structure. But you have these relational networks, things like the International Coalition of Apostles, or the Apostolic Council of Prophetic Elders, or the Eagles Vision Apostolic Team, Wagner's own inner mentoring circle. And the New Apostolic Reformation becomes this set of networks and a branding exercise, taking the latter rain ideas of apostles and prophets, blending that with these revival and spiritual warfare ideas, and apostles being the leaders of spiritual warfare. And this becomes then this whole new framework that, again, they're calling the New Apostolic Reformation. It is, when it starts, really a framework for reforming the life of the church. How do we transform the church through the leadership of apostles and prophets? And along the way, around 2001, in comes another guy named Lance Wallnau, who claims that he has a prophecy that it called the Seven Mountain Mandate. And the Seven Mountain Mandate, the basic idea is you can divide every society up into 7 arenas of influence: government, education, media, business, arts, family, and religion. And every one of those you conceive of as a mountain. And the tops of those mountains are either controlled by Satan and the demons or by God and the Christians, and there's no in between. And so the mandate is for Christians to take over all of the 7 mountains. And as this idea, Wagner loves this 7 mountains idea. He brings Wallnau into the inner circle, and Wallnau becomes one of the core leaders of the NAR. And the 7 mountains shifts the focus of the NAR from we're going to reform the church to we're going to take over the world. We can take over whole societies. And that's what we're meant to do as apostles and prophets. And if we fast forward then into the 2000s, these ideas continue to grow and build in these networks. And you have hundreds of charismatic leaders participating in these networks, all talking about being apostles and prophets, about playing around with Wagner's ideas, about being mentored by Wagner. They publish all kinds of books about this, branding the Seven Mountains as part of the NAR, talking about strategic level spiritual warfare, talking about apostles and prophets as the divinely ordered spiritual oligarchs over the church, talking about the Seven Mountains as this strategy for wholesale societal transformation. And all this kind of breaks on the scene in 2007, 2008, where they're really rolling it out. And just by happenstance, a woman that has in their networks, who they've been mentoring, a woman named Sarah Palin, who's the governor of Australia, who's been mentored by an NAR prophet, gets elevated by John McCain to be the vice presidential candidate out of nowhere. And they think in these NAR networks, this is the window of opportunity. We get to conquer the United States. The government mountain will be conquered by Sarah Palin, one of our followers, and we will be victorious. Now, of course, McCain and Palin lose in 2008 to Barack Obama and Joe Biden. And so in the Obama years, these NAR folks really go into an experience of desolation, this sense that the demons, the forces of Satan are taking over our country and we don't have the power anymore. Peter Wagner officially retires in 2010, and he starts to divvy up his networks and institutions among his followers. And also in 2013, this guy Dutch Sheets, who's been around these Wagner circles for more than 20 years at that point, believes that he receives a new prophecy. He discovers this flag. And it's a white flag with a green pine tree at the center and the phrase, "an appeal to heaven," across the top. And this is a flag that comes from the American Revolution. It was actually commissioned by George Washington in the American Revolution to fly over the Massachusetts Navy. But when Dutch Sheets discovered this flag, he believes this flag is a prophecy about the need for a spiritual revolution in America to overthrow liberal tyranny. Remember, this is 2013. This is right at the beginning of the second Obama administration. And they see Obama as a tyrant. And Dutch Sheets even claims that he's a Muslim. And so they start rolling out this campaign. And Dutch Sheets writes an entire book called An Appeal to Heaven. Sarah Palin helps to promote the Appeal to Heaven flag. But it becomes this groundswell new spiritual warfare campaign built around the Appeal to Heaven flag. And it just so happens that this Appeal to Heaven campaign is being rolled out right as Donald Trump is entering the political scene. And Donald Trump, after he rides down the golden escalator in June of 2015 and declares his presidential candidacy, turns to one of his closest friends, a woman named Paula White-Cain. And Paula White-Cain is a televangelist. She's a megachurch pastor. She's an apostle, and she's an independent, charismatic prosperity gospel preacher. And Trump asks her if she will be his liaison to evangelicals. Will she be in charge of reaching out to evangelicals? Now, the challenge is Paula White-Cain is not a conventional evangelical. She's a fourth quadrant evangelical. And so she starts reaching out to the people that she knows. And in the fall of 2015, you start to have a series of gatherings with Donald Trump as the candidate with these independent charismatic leaders that Paula White has gathered. And in those meetings is one Lance Wallnau, Mr. Seven Mountains. And Lance Wallnau, on his second meeting with Donald Trump, to his face, says, "I have a prophecy for you. And the prophecy is that you are an Isaiah 45 Cyrus." And if that reference doesn't mean anything to you, what he's saying there is Cyrus was this ancient Persian emperor in the 6th century BCE, who's the one who's responsible for sending the Jewish people back from exile to go and rebuild Jerusalem. And so what Wallnau is saying is that Donald Trump is like Cyrus. He's an outsider whom God can use. And in Isaiah chapter 45, God speaks about Cyrus as an anointed one, a Mashiach in Hebrew. This is where we get the term Messiah. And so Cyrus is a sort of secular Messiah for the Jewish people. And Wallnau is saying Donald Trump can be a sort of secular Messiah for American Christians. And this becomes part of this groundswell of prophecies around Donald Trump. Now, as you go through the 2016 campaign, most of the evangelical leaders, the first, second, and third quadrant evangelical leaders, don't want to touch Donald Trump with a 10-foot pole. Right? He's uncouth. He's been married 3 times. He doesn't even know 2 Corinthians versus 2 Corinthians. Right? They find him very offensive. But it's the fourth quadrant leaders, the televangelists, the apostles, the messianic rabbis, the prophets, the megachurch pastors who are endorsing Trump and vouching for him under the guidance and leadership of Paula White Cain. And as we get into the 2016 primary and then campaign, in February of 2016, Peter Wagner, hearing from Lance Wallnau about these ideas and prophecies about Trump, Peter Wagner endorses Donald Trump for the first time. He's ever done this in a presidential primary. He endorses a candidate. He's also dying at the time as he endorses it. And so people are paying very close attention to what Wagner is saying on his deathbed. And Wallnau, in the lead up to the 2016 campaign or election, really just wagers huge on Trump. And he writes an entire book where he's prophesying that Donald Trump will be the president, or at least is God's candidate to be the president. He talks about Donald Trump conquering the government mountain. And he really goes heavy on this. And right before he dies in October of 2016, Peter Wagner casts his absentee ballot for Donald Trump. And after he dies, his family posts this on Facebook. And his followers see this as another prophecy from Peter Wagner, a kind of final prophecy from Peter Wagner about Donald Trump. Now, of course, Donald Trump wins unexpectedly in the 2016 election. And almost immediately, the NAR kicks into high gear. So as Trump is inaugurated in January of 2017, these NAR leaders organize a big gala dinner called the Christian Inaugural Ball, where they are the keynoters, and they represent this ascendant new class of the religious right. And as Trump and the Trump administration sweep into DC, the NAR stand up a whole spiritual warfare campaign on behalf of Donald Trump as the new president. They call it POTUS Shield. POTUS is President of the United States. And this is in order to protect Donald Trump from these spiritual forces that are coming against him. And they're saying Donald Trump is God's candidate, and we need to support him with prayer. But tacitly and behind the scenes, what's going on here is they're also baptizing Trump's agenda as God's agenda. And to oppose Trump is to oppose God and support the cause of demons, right? So they're sacralizing the agenda of the Trump administration. And over the course of the Trump administration, some of these NAR leaders become very, very important official and unofficial Trump advisors. And Paula White Cain becomes chair of Donald Trump's Evangelical Advisory Board. And if you look at the lists of Trump's advisory boards, his evangelical advisory boards, at least half of every one of them have been independent charismatics. So you have this group of independent charismatics moving from the margins of American Christianity and becoming central players in the religious right through their proximity to Donald Trump, and the NAR is central to that. As the Trump administration goes on, this is where we get this genre of these photos of Trump with NAR leaders almost always front and center. In many of these photos, what is actually happening is people are prophesying over Trump, and these prophecies, like the one that Wallnau gave about Cyrus, begin to accumulate over the course of the Trump administration. By 2020, there are hundreds of these charismatic prophecies about Donald Trump. And as this is going on, the NAR leaders are also continuing to build this spiritual warfare fervor around Donald Trump. In fact, when Donald Trump, during his first term, is doing sensitive nuclear negotiations with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, Mike Pence has Dutch Sheets and Paula White Cain and Cindy Jacobs and all these people lead a prayer call on behalf of the White House. And they're tapping into these NAR prayer and spiritual warfare networks, all tied now to the Trump administration. In November of 2019, Paula White Cain becomes an official White House employee. And one of the first things she does, just a few days after she gets into that role, is she convenes a planning meeting for what they call the One Voice Prayer Movement, a hyper-partisan prayer movement coordinated out of the White House by NAR leaders to help Trump win in 2020. And so you have NAR leaders like Dutch Sheets and Cindy Jacobs being invited into the White House about a year out from the presidential election in 2020. As we get into 2020, again, you have hundreds of these prophecies that are building and surrounding Trump. And all these prophecies are saying that Donald Trump is God's choice to win the 2020 election. In October of 2020, Donald Trump is campaigning in Las Vegas, Nevada, and he goes to an NAR church called the International Church of Las Vegas. And the NAR apostle, first the prophets in the congregation prophesy over Trump. And then during his sermon, the NAR apostle gets up and he holds up an appeal to heaven flag. And he says, I saw this sign of victory over the White House. This is a sign we're summoning the angels of heaven for you, Mr. President. And there's a photo that's snapped of him holding the appeal to heaven flag with Donald Trump in the foreground. And that photo goes viral on charismatic social media. And it's just a few days after this visit to the International Church of Las Vegas, after these prophecies and this appeal to heaven sermon, that Donald Trump changes his official religious identity from being a Presbyterian to being a non-denominational Christian. He's responding to these folks. He is interacting with their claims. Now, when Donald Trump loses the 2020 election and refuses to concede, these NAR leaders launch a massive spiritual warfare campaign in order to see these prophecies fulfilled. And Dutch Sheets and Lance Wallnau are the two of the most prominent in leading this, and they're on every podcast and every televangelism show they can go on. But it's also Cindy Jacobs and Che On and Chuck Pierce. Really, all of Wagner's inner circle are helping to drive this narrative that Donald Trump is the prophesied president, and we need to support him and stand with him. And over that span, from November of 2020 through January 6th, they start building this crescendo, this fervor. We need to fulfill the prophecies. We need to do spiritual warfare. Trump is God's chosen candidate. And they start organizing a series of marches called the Jericho Marches, many of them in the swing state capitals. But the main one culminates in Washington, D.C. on December 12th of 2020. And Lance Wallnau and Cindy Jacobs both speak at the Jericho March in Washington, D.C. Also, Jonathan Cahn, a very prominent Messianic rabbi, gives the keynote address at the Jericho March in Washington, D.C. And then just a couple weeks after that, about 8 days out from January 6th, on December 29th, 2020, Dutch Sheets leads a team of apostles and prophets for a 2-hour White House meeting with undisclosed White House administration officials. I've never been able to figure out exactly who was meeting with them from the White House, but these NAR leaders come out of this White House meeting, which is well documented. There's all kinds of photo evidence of them being there. And they come out, they're saying, we were talking strategy with people in the know at the highest levels of the U.S. government. As we get closer and closer to January 6th, on the eve of January 6th, on January 5th, there's a big rally in Washington, D.C. as part of the beginning festivities around January 6th. It's called the Rally for Revival. Che On, this mentee of Peter Wagner's, speaks at this January 5th rally in Washington, D.C. And he issues an apostolic declaration of prophecy where he says, we are going to rule and reign through President Trump under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And this becomes then kind of part of the iconography of January 6th in these charismatic circles. And that rally goes on for about 8 hours. The first half is mostly charismatic pastors like Che On speaking. The second half is people like Michael Flynn and Alex Jones and Roger Stone speaking, right? So you see this blending of the Trump inner circle with these kind of NAR leaders. And then on January 6th, I have tracked at least 60 independent charismatic Christian leaders who were in Washington, D.C. for January 6th. They believed it was a day when they had to do spiritual warfare. Most of them were joining the crowds surrounding the Capitol. At least 7 of these folks faced criminal prosecution for their participation that day. And these folks range from local pastors to global celebrity prophets with millions of followers. And at least 5 members of Peter Wagner's inner circle are there in the crowds on January 6th. One of the beliefs in these circles is that the shofar, this ram's horn that comes from Jewish liturgical usage, is a weapon of spiritual warfare. And this is why you see the shofar all over the place around the Capitol riot. In fact, if you look at the picture here of these 2 women, one of them is caught on video going up to the broken out windows of the Capitol, blowing the shofar into the broken out windows. Again, this is about spiritual warfare. That's the purpose. We also that day see groups of Christians gathering during the riot, sometimes just yards away from where people are actively beating Capitol police officers, singing worship songs. Again, as participation in spiritual warfare. This is spiritual warfare practices. This is independent charismatic spirituality on display around the riot. Cindy Jacobs and Becca Greenwood. Again, Becca Greenwood, who is there on January, or excuse me, at the Operation Ice Castle. They are outside the Capitol prophesying and praying, and they even have Dutch Sheets come in on conference call around this group. In the middle of the riot, this is all going on with the NAR leaders. Lance Wallnau was scheduled to speak at a January 6th rally. There were several rallies scheduled for around the Capitol. The one at 1 p.m. outside the U.S. Capitol that was canceled because of the rioting. Well, Lance Wallnau was supposed to speak there alongside Marjorie Taylor Greene and Roger Stone and Lauren Boebert, right? These are the circles they are traveling in. And because that one gets canceled, he goes back to his Trump International hotel room on January 6th and brought live broadcasts on this Flashpoint Spiritual Warfare and Prophecy show, all talking about January 6th and the riot at the Capitol. On January 6th, we see these appeal to heaven flags everywhere in the crowds. There's dozens, maybe even hundreds of them. We see them when the crowds are gathering at the Trump rally, at the Ellipse. We see them around the Washington Monument as the crowds are moving across the mall towards the Capitol. We see them on the front lines as the crowd is skirmishing with the Capitol police officers. We know of at least one rioter who wore an appeal to heaven flag as a cape into the Capitol. And when the FBI later went to arrest him, they found the appeal to heaven flag in his home, and it was spattered with blood and with mace from the riot. After January 6th, these NAR leaders don't drop this. They come to believe that Donald Trump is still God's chosen candidate, and they keep pushing for Trump to be restored. As Trump goes into the wilderness after January 6th, as there's these questions of whether he has any political future, the NAR leaders stick strong with him. And these prophecies around Donald Trump continue to flow, and they continue to talk about him as this figure of prophecy. In fact, at one point, Dutch Sheets and Lance Wallnau and these other Flashpoint leaders gather a group in Georgia, a group of about 10,000 people, and they all together say this Watchman decree that Dutch Sheets wrote. And this is just a portion of it. Whereas we, the church, are God's governing body on the earth, we've been given legal power from heaven and now exercise our authority. We decree that we take back and permanently control positions of influence and leadership in each of the 7 mountains. We will never stop fighting. We will never, ever, ever give up or give in. We will take our country back. And this is the message that begins to build after January 6th in the lead up to the 2024 election. We continue to see after January 6th, these appeal to heaven flags proliferating all over the place. We've seen them in neo-Nazi groups in Oregon and New England. They've started to fly the appeal to heaven flag. We see them at Supreme Court Justice Sam Alito's summer vacation home on the Jersey Shore. He blamed it on his wife. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, flies an appeal to heaven flag outside of his congressional office. And when my colleague Brad Onishi and I exposed this on Rolling Stone in November of 2023, we reached out to Johnson's office, and he said that they got the flag from an NAR pastor, and he just appreciates it for the history. Donald Trump himself has leaned into these prophecy narratives in recent years. He's begun to embrace these prophecy narratives. He's retweeted this AI-generated image of himself at the defense table alongside Jesus. He has been telling Christians about how they won't have to vote anymore if they just vote for him this election. He'll take care of everything. This kind of apocalyptic, messianic promise. He has really especially leaned into the narratives about the assassination attempts on him, claiming that he was saved by divine providence, saved to save America, right? This very messianic claim. In the 2024 campaign, the NAR leaders actively campaigned for Donald Trump. In fact, Lance Wallnau led a swing state revival tour. It was claimed to be a revival tour. In reality, it was a political and voter mobilization tour. They only went to the swing states. The whole day program was about Trump and conspiracy theories and political mobilization. In fact, at one of these stops, when I was there, Lance Wallnau said January 6th was not an insurrection. It was an election fraud intervention. And at another one of these stops in Pennsylvania, J.D. Vance joined the Lance Wallnau Roadshow to live cast a town hall meeting from Lance Wallnau's tour in order to give Lance Wallnau a pat on the back. The NAR leaders, in the lead up to the 2024 election, held huge prayer events on the National Mall, including this one called the Million Women March, that again, I was there, and it went on for about 10 hours that day. All the NAR core leaders were there. It was right in front of the National Mall. There were between 50 and 100,000 people there. Very multi-ethnic crowd. And at this gathering, you had Cindy Jacobs and Dutch Sheets and Cheon and Lou Engle. And Cheon got up to give another apostolic declaration. And this is what he said. Trump is a type of Jehu, and Kamala Harris is a type of Jezebel. And I decree it by faith that Trump will win. On November the 5th, he will be our 47th president, and Kamala Harris will be cast down. She will lose in Jesus' mighty name. If you know anything about the story he's referring to, this is one of the most brutal stories in the entire Hebrew Bible, about where they are using this typology to say Kamala Harris is Jezebel, who is this famously wicked queen in the Hebrew Bible, and Donald Trump is Jehu. And Jehu is the anointed king who slaughters Jezebel. A brutal story. This is in 1 Kings chapter 9. So this is the imagery they are leading into the election with. Remember that photo from October 23rd, 2024? Well, there is Cheon, and Lance Wallnau was there in the crowd as well, with hands directly on Donald Trump. This is after he's made this very violent declaration about Trump is a Jehu, and then a few days later, has his hand right on Trump's shoulder. At that gathering, just a few days later, Jonathan Cahn got up. This is, again, this photo from October of 2024. Jonathan Cahn got up and issued a prophecy over Donald Trump. And this is what he said. He was the one from the Jericho March, the keynote speaker. And he said, Mr. President, I speak of the mystery of your life. God called you to walk according to the template of Jehu. Jehu came to the capital city with an agenda to drain the swamp. Jehu was born to make his nation great again by turning it back to God. If you go and read that story in 2 Kings chapter 10, what is the template of Jehu? Jehu slaughters all the family of Ahab and Jezebel. That's what this drain the swamp is about. And he piles the heads of their children up at the city gates as a warning. This is the violent imagery. Note, Jonathan Cahn is not saying, hey, I noticed some interesting parallels between Donald Trump and this Jehu figure. He's saying this is a script. This is a template that Donald Trump has to follow. Donald Trump has to live out the violence of Jehu. This was the message the NAR leaders were promoting in the lead up to this election, telling their followers, conditioning their followers that Donald Trump has to be violent. That is his role. Okay, we're almost to the end. Just about a month and a half ago, these leaders gathered once again around Donald Trump in February, early February, and Donald Trump, on the same day that these folks gathered around him in the White House for this photo op, and there's Paula White Cain in the white dress at the center, Trump announced that Paula White Cain would lead his new White House Faith Office, giving her an even higher profile than she has ever had in the administration. And he also announced through an executive order a new task force for, quote, eradicating anti-Christian bias. Not eradicating anti-Semitism, not eradicating Islamophobia, two forms of religious bias that are rampant in our society today, especially as this war is going on between Israel and Gaza. But no, this is about eradicating anti-Christian bias. Christians make up 2/3 of the country. There is no widespread anti-Christian bias. But this is part of the agenda of Christian supremacy. And this task force is to be led out of the Department of Justice. So it has real legal power behind it. So, as we conclude, remember what I said early on. Religious movements that threaten democracy are those that privilege one religious community and their citizenship over other communities and their citizenship, like eradicating anti-Christian bias, but not anti-Semitic or anti-secular or Islamophobic bias. There's all kinds of religious bias in our country. Anti-Christian bias is not a real big one of them, right? And yet this is the focus. Using demonization and threats of violence to bring authoritarian leaders to power. Everything that we saw around January 6th was about the demonization of their enemies and about this authoritarian grasp for power. And baptizing an authoritarian agenda in theology to make it seem like it's God's agenda. And I will argue that we have never seen in American history this kind of religious fervor and messianic fervor around a national level political leader in American history. We're in a unique situation around this. So if we go back to our 4 quadrants model, I'd argue that the first quadrant, this kind of denominational, non-charismatic space, was this most institutionally hefty part of evangelicalism. That was the center of gravity of the religious right in the 1980s through the 2000s. But what we're seeing in the last decade is that the 4th quadrant is the new center of gravity in the religious right in the Trump era, due to the influence of Paula White Cain and the NAR. They're the ones who brokered this deal, built this team of religious leaders and propagandists around Donald Trump, surrounded him with these advisors who are also selling him to Christians. All right, let me give 4 final thoughts, and then we'll have time for some questions. I don't think Donald Trump would be the president today without these Christian supremacist theologies, and especially these charismatic prophecies that have surrounded him with this aura, this spiritual aura, and have sanctified him and made him into a quasi-messianic figure in the eyes of many Christians and many evangelicals and many other non-evangelical Christians in America. Think about Trump in these messianic terms. So, in answer to our question, has evangelical Christianity become a threat to American democracy? I would say yes. Some very powerful and well-connected American evangelicals, not all, but some, absolutely pose a profound threat to American democracy. They do not care about democracy. They care about enacting their religious agenda, bringing about the revival that they think God has destined and prophesied for America. And many other evangelicals and other American Christians contribute to this by supporting it, offering their unwavering support to Trump and MAGA. It's one thing to support a political candidate and have your reservations and to criticize and challenge. No one in this coalition is challenging Trump today. And what we're living through now is an almost unprecedentedly fast slide into illiberal democracy in the beginning of the Trump administration. That is what has been playing out over the last 7 or 8 weeks. And the administration itself is stripping away the rule of law, the separation of powers, and free speech rights. And I would argue American democracy has never faced a greater crisis than what we are going through right now. It is an existential threat to American democracy, to American liberal democracy. We'll still have elections, ostensibly, but will they be free and fair? Will the rule of law persist? Those are the questions on the table right now. And so we need a broad-based resistance movement to this. We need secular and non-Christian and Christian people all to come together and to challenge this stuff right now. We need to stand against this if we're going to protect American democracy. But we also need a theological resistance movement because the propaganda itself is theological. And you aren't going to be able to dispel it just by talking about human rights or the values of democracy. We need to have a theological argument in the United States today about how theology is being used to bolster authoritarianism. I'm going to end it there. Thank you.
Man, thank you so much, Matt. That was so good. I know we've had you on the program a couple times and we've talked through this, but seeing it presented in one like organized case is pretty amazing. So we do have some questions here. I'm just doing them in the order that we've received them.
Sure.
So the first one is a question on Elon Musk.
Mm.
So he doesn't appear to have any clear religious beliefs. This is one of our listeners. Yet he's widely celebrated in the same circles that elevate prophetic figures and spiritual warfare rhetoric. What does Musk represent to these movements? And is his role symbolic, or is there deeper theological accommodation happening, do you think?
So 2 thoughts. One is these folks are kind of primed to like oligarchs, right? I mean, even the apostles and prophets in their world are functionally spiritual oligarchs, right? They exist on a different plane. They have this direct connection to God. And so kind of just instinctually, these folks are very comfortable with the idea of oligarchy and of separating people into kind of tiers of value and influence. So there's not a like anti-authoritarian dimension that would push back against a figure like Musk. And Elon Musk did, in the lead up to the 24 election, did a big event at an NAR church called Life Center in Harrisburg. This was part of his campaign, really trying to focus on Pennsylvania. Now, if you asked Elon Musk, what does the acronym NAR stand for? I doubt he could tell you what that means, right? I don't think that he is theologically sophisticated. I don't think he has any depth in these circles. I don't think he has any deep relationships with these folks, but they love a convert. They love people who come from the left and then convert over into their version of Christianity. And Elon Musk has recently talked about being a cultural Christian. I think he's one of these figures, kind of like a Russell Brand or a Jordan Peterson or a Joe Rogan, that they celebrate as a cultural influencer. Again, he fits in the 7 mountains. And even more recently, they've started taking and combining and merging the arts and entertainment and the media mountain into one mountain so they can have a separate mountain for science and technology. Now, I don't know why God didn't think of that in 2001 when he was revealing the 7 mountains, but the science and technology is a very important part of the conversation. And I think they see Elon as a sort of figure who could dominate the tech mountain for them and provide them with this kind of cover, this umbrella cover through his technology and his influence.
That's really good. So here's another one. It's about J.D. Vance and traditionalist Catholicism. So J.D. Vance's religious roots are in traditionalist Catholicism, liturgically and ideologically, worlds apart from the independent charismatic movement. How does someone like Vance fit into this spiritual political ecosystem? And are we witnessing a kind of cross-denominational alliance around authoritative values, or are there shared theological ideas and motifs at play, like spiritual warfare, Christian nationalism, moral restoration, that kind of thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's always been collaboration since the beginning of the religious right in the 1980s between Catholics and Protestants. That's kind of in many ways, the alliance that formed and shaped the religious right in the United States in the last half century. So it's not unusual to see Catholic figures playing alongside these kind of evangelical figures, sometimes even adopting evangelical discourse. And I would note that J.D. Vance grew up kind of evangelical-ish in Ohio, and even there's elements of charismaticism in his background as well. So this is not foreign to him. This is kind of the world that he grew up in more, it's more that he's moved and migrated over into this kind of Catholic world. I will note when he was speaking if you go and watch the video of this town hall he did at this Wallnow tour, it wasn't Wallnow interviewing, it was this other pastor, and the pastor was this charismatic pastor, and there was some delay, and so the pastor had to like ad lib for like 15 minutes before J.D. Vance comes out. So the pastor's just telling his story, right, and his own background, and the crowd's there and they're shouting amen and they're really vibing with him, and then J.D. Vance comes out and he just lacks charisma, across every kind of charisma across the board. And the crowd is just deadpan every time the camera goes to them. Like, this is a charismatic crowd. They want to react. They are not reacting to JD Vance. So I don't think he has a deep connection in terms of charisma or his own personality there, but there is a deep alliance theologically. There are real fissures between the kind of radical traditionalist Catholic wing, which tends to more dominate influence around the Supreme Court, and through organizations like the Heritage Foundation, and then J.D. Vance is kind of their avatar in this administration. They've been trying to push for more power, but they really have more power in the kind of legal constitutional law world, where it's Paula White and the independent charismatics who dominate these advisory circles around Trump. And I would argue that if we really do see a big shift and these Christians begin taking a lot more power in this administration, a lot of these internecine fights among these so-called Christian nationalists are going to surface, because there are real theological tensions among these groups. And I think that Vance would be representing kind of another wing of the kind of Christian nationalist coalition in that kind of a fight. And I'm not sure who would win that fight.
Fascinating. So this one is Mike Johnson, a Baptist or NAR sympathizer. So
Yeah.
he's often described as being aligned with NAR thinking, but he's also a lifelong Southern Baptist. Can you help clarify whether his alignment is theological, relational, or strategic? And how do you explain the apparent overlap between traditional non-charismatic evangelicals and charismatic dominionist agendas?
Yeah, it's a great question. The Mike Johnson is a Southern Baptist. That's his identity. That's kind of church he attends. He's also very close friends with an NAR apostle in Shreveport in his district named Timothy Carskaden. And Timothy Carskaden is a mentee of Dutch Sheets. And so, and like Mike Johnson has spoken at Timothy Carskaden's church, has invited Timothy Carskaden to come visit him in Washington, D.C. So like it's a real friendship. There's real depth to that. So I think Mike Johnson is a creature of the religious right. He came up as a lawyer for the religious right. He has been running in these circles all of his life. And so I think he's kind of rubbed shoulders with these people a lot over the years. And from the NAR's perspective, they don't need somebody to be a follower of them to be an ally of theirs. And they see him very much as an ally. The Appeal to Heaven flag that he flies was given to him by an NAR pastor. In fact, Mike Johnson himself has said that he's been mentored by an NAR apostle named Jim Garlow. And Jim Garlow was not part of Peter Wagner's inner circle early on, but kind of added in later on around the time Wagner was retiring. And he's a very influential player. I mean, very close to Clarence and Jenny Thomas as well, Jim Garlow. So he's kind of this behind the scenes player in DC who seems to have had a lot of influence over Mike Johnson. And I think he really kind of is that point of connection for that point of that alliance. I would not call Mike Johnson part of the NAR or a follower of the NAR. I would say that he is an ally of the NAR, coming from these more establishment, conventional religious right circles, but very much kind of mirroring their theology and their kind of accelerationist impulses.
That's good. So we have a question about charismatic versus political values. So, how much does theological identity, for example, charismatic v non-charismatic, still matter in distinguishing groups today, or has a shared set of political values like spiritual warfare against wokeness, the idea of divine national destiny, has that become the glue that binds very different traditions together?
Very good question. Well, first of all, in the independent charismatic space, and this is why it's important that we talk about independent charismatic as separate from, say, the third quadrant where you have these denominational structures, there never really was that much shared theology. Because,
Mm,
right, you have, I mean, it's non-denominational, right? There are no traditions, there are no kind of carriers or institutions to hold this theology together. And so what has grown in that space is more of a meme culture of theology, right? These prophecies and these words and the apostolic decrees, all this kind of travels around this charismatic media space in more of a meme fashion. And because of that, people can kind of play with whichever memes, and like the Seven Mountains is a meme, right? It's got theology in it, but it really is not coming out of biblical exegesis. It's a prophecy that people are claiming they need to fulfill, and it has traveled in this kind of meme-like viral way all around these circles. So it's not that there was this like deep systematic shared theology that then got co-opted by politics. It's more that there was this meme culture, this very loose, amorphous culture. And as these prophecies about Trump took hold there and became so important, they took over the theological landscape. Today, there are still some pockets in the independent charismatic space that are resisting Christian Trumpism, especially in prominently Black networks, as far as I can tell, are some of the real outposts still of resistance to this independent charismatic kind of band circling the wagons around Donald Trump. There still are some of these pockets of independent charismatic African American networks that are resisting that. But the vast majority, I mean, probably 90% of independent charismatics, as far as I can tell, have all banded together around Donald Trump, and in this extremely fervent way. Again, fueled by these prophecies and the certainty that he is God's anointed candidate, God's anointed leader, and so they've become really the vanguard of Christian Trumpism. There's all these other evangelicals who are attaching on to Trump, but the independent charismatics, they are just front of the pack. And what we're seeing locally right now is just legions of these independent charismatic leaders, hundreds, thousands of these independent charismatic leaders, local pastors, local activists, prophets, worship leaders, just coming out of the woodwork and taking over local politics, fighting over school boards, trying to run for Congress, trying to run for city council, trying to activate these kind of political revivals in their regions and in their communities. And so they really have become the frontline captains of the religious right more recently. And I think when we talk, and at this point, I'm not sure you can separate out the politics and the theology, because they've become so wedded together that they really are tapping into these very old Christian impulses around the divine right of kings and Christian imperialism to cast Donald Trump as God's anointed leader over the United States in this kind of monarchic fashion. I mean, they think of him and even will speak about him as a king. And so they've really moved beyond democracy, both in their theology and their politics. And I would argue that their politics kind of fuels the theological radicalization, but also their theology is fueling their political radicalization today.
gotcha. So two questions that are kind of about NAR's power strategy and a post-Trump future. So Basically, are NAR affiliated leaders signaling any vision for political and spiritual leadership beyond Trump? So, kind of how do we see Trump and where they go from here, and how directly involved have NAR leaders been or their allies been in shaping and supporting Project 2025?
Sure. Great. Yeah, it won't shock you to know that these people are not they're not policy wonks, and they're not systematic thinkers. So they're prophets, right? They're claiming that they are receiving these words from God. They're very, very good at this kind of charismatic celebrity thing, at kind of casting themselves as these spiritual oracles that receive these insights from God, but they are not political strategists. And so I have not heard any talk, from what I can tell, might be happening behind closed doors, about what happens when Donald Trump leaves the scene. I mean, if Donald Trump were to die tomorrow, I have no idea what these people would do. I mean, they would not back down. They would not recede back into the woodwork. They've got a taste for power. They see a window of opportunity, and they are trying to maximize that opportunity. I don't know if they would band together around a J.D. Vance or a Pete Hegseth, or whether they would just find their own kind of person. I mean, there's a lot of incentive structure in Republican politics right now to kind of map yourself on, to mirror Donald Trump's style, and to kind of adopt this style of MAGA spirituality. I think if we're looking further down the line, kind of future generations, I think we should pay very close attention to Tucker Carlson, in the way that he has recently kind of started adopting some of this charismatic language to talk about his own life. And I think Charlie Kirk, further down the line, is very much in this vein and has some real ambitions in American politics.
Wow. So speaking of that, thinking about who else is tied to NAR from Congress, what other members of Congress or Trump administration figures are explicitly connected to the NAR network, or who consistently echo like NAR style theology and strategy?
Yeah, there's a number of them. I'm not going to remember all their names at the moment. There's a few Congress people who fly appeal to heaven flags, either outside of their congressional offices or their home offices in their district. And in that same gathering in Georgia, where they did the Watchman decree and the over Flashpoint with Dutch Sheets and Lance Wallnow reading this Watchman decree, they also prayed over Marjorie Taylor Greene and anointed and blessed her. And she's hung out with a number of these leaders. Sean Foyt, who is a very prominent worship leader in the NAR movement, was mentored by Che Ahn and Cindy Jacobs and a number of these other figures. Sean Foyt hangs out with Lauren Boebert quite a bit. There's a relatively new congresswoman named Anna Paulina Luna from Florida, who has claimed an identity as a Messianic Jew, who also kind of runs in these charismatic celebrity circles. I mean, at this point, it's a lot more than a handful of congressional leaders, and some of it is again, if you ask a lot of those congressional leaders, are you part of the NAR? They probably wouldn't even know what you're talking about. They're like, you mean the NRA, right? Like, that's just this is not the vocabulary that gets used in their circles. But as these folks have grown in influence, there's a lot of Hill staffers who are kind of participating in these ideas, and it's begun to take over as the spirituality of the far right. And you're seeing militia movements starting to adopt these kind of spiritual warfare language and this language of revival as well. And so I think what we're seeing is less like, oh, this movement has these people, and more the ideas of the movement keep spreading further and further in these Republican circles and getting more and more traction and power. Whether they're framed as charismatic or NAR or not, they're becoming much more popular.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we have a question about what life is like on the inside of the culture. So thinking about outside of high level political focus, what's the actual spiritual culture like for parishioners inside these independent, charismatic, or NAR affiliated churches? What do their weekly experiences look like? Sermons, prayer practices, community dynamics? Is it always like political and apostolic agendas, or is it like, do you think there's like being drawn to the experiential worship, healing services, prophetic culture, stuff like that?
I mean, it's the whole package. Because if you've ever been to one of these services, I mean, they are immersive. I mean, it's like a rock concert mixed with a revival meeting, with somebody getting up and claiming that they're a prophet and they're prophesying and giving the words of God to individual people, right? I mean, it's very entertaining, very exciting, very life affirming for people who participate in it. It's got a real magnetic quality to it, and I have no problem with people being charismatic, right? Like, and if you think about the skill set that these leaders have developed, their skill set, many of them did not go to seminary. Many of them have not had formal training. They've been apprenticed and they've learned these things from other leaders. And what they've been trained to do is give people powerful, emotional, spiritual experiences. And that, as a religious community, fine, absolutely fine, great, wonderful that you're giving people good spiritual experiences. It's when those skills cross over into politics, and that skill set of being able to give people powerful emotional and spiritual experiences, when applied to American politics, and suddenly you're going to a political rally and there's a prophet gets up and speaking about prophecies about Donald Trump and inculcating these kind of spiritual experiences, but then tying them directly to partisan politics, that's where we get into some real danger. And yes, so these services are full of politics. I mean, some of these pastors will preach half their sermon is about contemporary politics. I think a lot of these folks too, a lot of their followers might not be showing up at a brick and mortar church every Sunday. They might just be following these prophets on YouTube or on social media, right? And depending on how many prophets you're following, that can fill up your week, right? And a lot of these folks, they'll attend big prophecy conferences. I mean, we tend to think too much, I think, that brick and mortar churches are still the lifeblood infrastructure of Christianity in America. I would argue it's much more media and social media that is driving the action, especially when it comes to politics and religion, than the brick and mortar churches that tend to be a little more grounded and denominationally regulated and tend to have more boundaries than these kind of prophets out there in the ether. In terms of the leadership culture, really quick, the leadership culture in these independent charismatic circles, it's a little bit Hollywood, because they're all celebrities. It's also a little bit mafia, because at this point, there's no written rules, because there's no institutions. It's just networks of relationships, but there's a lot of unwritten rules, and there's a very clear pecking order. And if you go get crossways with one of the big name people, you're done. And the rules are basically, you can say whatever you want theologically, you can say whatever you want prophetically, you can claim wild dreams, you can ask people to give you money because you've got some vision. You can't say anything bad about Trump. That's the ground rule. And if you say something bad about Trump, they will end you. And so a lot of these leaders that I interact with, some of them are very scared. Many of them would speak out if they had a little more courage and a little bit more of group support. But as things currently stand, their whole life is wrapped around this stuff. And even if they have their hesitations about Trump, they toe the party line.
Man. So the last question. So, well, it's kind of, again, two kind of wrapped up into one, but one person wondered about Sean Hawley, I think. Yeah, Josh Hawley. Sorry,
Josh
not
Hawley.
Sean, Josh Hawley, and his connection. And then what do you see about like this anti-Christian task force for eradicating anti-Christian bias? What should we expect from it? What do we anticipate it actually doing?
Yeah. So Josh Hawley hangs out with Sean Foyt quite a bit. In fact, when after January 6th, Josh Hawley made a special trip to California to go hang out at Bethel Church, which is Sean Foyt's home church, Bill Johnson's church in Northern California. He also went down to Southern California to hang out at Cheon's church and be interviewed by Cheon on YouTube. So Josh Hawley comes from more kind of conventional Calvinist denominational circles, but he's not like Mike Johnson, right? He's a creature of the religious right, and he sees these people as very powerful allies and really wants to get on their good side. And I think he's a very, very ambitious figure, both he and his wife. His wife is also very, very involved in politics. She's a lawyer who, like Mike Johnson, has kind of come up in these religious rights circles and is very active in Republican politics. In terms of, sorry, what was the second question?
The second question, just like what should we expect from the anti-Christian bias
Oh, yeah,
task
yeah.
force?
You know, I mentioned India and Narendra Modi. If you go to India today, um, there's a lot of talk about Hindu phobia. Now, Hindu phobia is a real thing. And like in the United States, Hindus experience Hindu phobia, right? Where there's prejudice against Hindus, and they only make up about 1% of the U.S. population. So there often are hate crimes or bad things said, or kind of tense confrontations that Hindus experience in the U.S. It's a real thing. In India, about 80% of the population is Hindu. So there's no widespread Hindu phobia in India, and yet there's a lot of talk about Hindu phobia, and that becomes the pretext for mobs of Hindus to go and beat up on the Muslim minority, to say they are persecuting us. By definition, unless it's a situation like South Africa where you have a minority population ruling over a majority population, minorities don't persecute majorities. That's just not how it works. They don't have the power to. And so in India today, all this talk about Hindu phobia is the cover, the rhetorical cover for the majority to beat up on minorities. And I would argue that this task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias is a manifestation of that in the US, where the Christian majority is claiming itself as persecuted in order to go and beat up on other groups of people. We haven't seen a lot since the executive order in terms of what's going on. I mean, Trump named half of his cabinet to the task force. So a few of those folks had a couple other things going on recently that has kept them a little bit busy.
Right.
I would not be surprised if we get a few months from now to where that group actually starts gathering, and it's being led by Pam Bondi, the leader of the Department of Justice. So I would not be surprised. And one of the subcategories of this, one of the ideas that I've heard kicking around, is that they would implant members of the task force in the different agencies who would all report to Paula White King. I don't know exactly how that's going to come together, but so they're trying to create reporting mechanisms. Everything's chaos in the federal government right now with all of Elon Musk's cuts and the scandals and all this stuff. But whenever they get their act together, I think that is a space to watch, because I think it is going to be one of the places where they are really going to try to go after their enemies, and many of their enemies are liberal Christians. And I think that in the same way that the anti-Semitism discourse is often used right now to go after liberal Jews, I would not be surprised if they start going after Christian nationalism. Anyone who talks about Christian nationalism, or anyone who's a progressive Christian, now gets labeled an enemy and a persecutor of Christians.
Man. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for all of your expertise and sharing that with us. I'm sorry to everyone that there's a couple questions that we couldn't get to, but where would you push people towards right now to get more information, to follow what you're doing, and to get into the other questions they have answered?
So my book gets into all this in a great deal more detail. The Violent Ticket by Force, get it anywhere. If you're interested in following some more of what I do and the work that I'm involved in, I work at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, icjs.org. You can sign up for our newsletters and things that we have going on. All of our programs are free to the public. We are running different things every month. Please keep an eye on the NAR and these groups that are going right now, and pay attention locally too, because a lot of this stuff is happening at a local level. And get involved, especially for Christians. Get involved in speaking out against this stuff. Encourage your pastors to speak out about this stuff. We need Christian leaders in this moment to have a theological fight, because this is a theological cluster of ideas around Donald Trump that is propping him up, especially with his Christian followers, who are his most ardent followers. And if we're going to break that hammerlock, it's going to have to be a theological fight.
That's really good. I appreciate it, Matt. Thank you so much for coming and spending some time with us today. Matt, it's been a pleasure. Absolutely. And guys, thanks so much for joining us on this first ever Beyond the Echo Chamber. Make sure you guys check us out on YouTube. Go to the website, faithfulpoliticspodcast.com. and then faithfulpolitics.com you can go to and make sure that you guys are checking us out. Can't wait to connect with you. Subscribe, like, do all the things that hack the algorithm so we can get this great content out. And make sure you check out Matt's book. And you can come back to this later to the live stream and the channel on the playlist, and we'll have all sorts of links for you guys to check out. Well, thanks, guys. And until next time, we're going to have another one coming up here soon. So we'll keep you guys updated on that. God bless. Keep your conversations not right or left, but up. See you then. Thanks, Matt. That was great.
Good.
Really great.